All right, so today we're diving into something a bit unsettling,
Yeah, a little bit.
the concept of decivilization.
Ooh.
And we're going to look at whether or not it's happening right here, right now in America.
Yeah, it's a big question.
It is, and our source material is an article from The Atlantic called Decivilization May Already Be Underway by Adrienne LaFrance.
And this article starts off with a story that really grabs your attention. It's about a CEO who was murdered in broad daylight in Midtown Manhattan.
Oh, wow.
But here's the really unsettling part. Instead of shock and outrage, some people publicly celebrated his death.
That's really disturbing.
It is. It makes you wonder, what's going on? What's happening in society that something like that could happen?
It's a chilling way to start off, for sure.
Yeah.
And it really sets the stage for an exploration of how societies can shift towards violence.
Right.
The article isn't saying America is on the brink of collapse or anything like that, but
Right.
it does point to some parallels with historically violent periods
Yeah.
that are a bit unsettling.
Yeah. And to really understand these parallels, we need to define what decivilization even means.
Okay.
So sociologist Norbert Elias, who LaFrance mentions in the article, tackled this back in the 1930s.
Okay.
He argued that being civilized isn't just about using the right fork at dinner or saying please and thank you.
Right.
It's about something much bigger.
Okay.
It's about the state, the government having a monopoly on violence.
So instead of individuals taking the law into their own hands, we have systems and institutions in place to deal with conflict and crime.
Exactly. That's what it means to be civilized in this sense.
Okay.
Decivilization, on the other hand, is what happens when that balance shifts.
Okay.
When individuals and groups start resorting to violence to solve their problem.
Instead of relying on the established systems.
Right. It's like taking a step back in time towards a more chaotic and dangerous way of life.
Okay, I see where this is going. So how does this connect to what's happening in America today?
Well, Elias actually studied this concept by looking at medieval Europe, a period where violence was extremely common.
Oh, wow.
Imagine a world where duels to the death were a common way to settle disputes.
Really?
Oh yeah. Feuds between families could last for generations.
Wow.
Even minor disagreements could erupt into these big, bloody brawls. It was a very different world.
That's hard to imagine
Yeah.
living in a society like that. But things started to change over time, right?
They did, yes.
Okay, good.
And this is where Elias's work gets really interesting. He argues that as societies evolve, self-control and nonviolence become more advantageous.
Right.
Not just for individuals,
Right.
but for society as a whole.
Right.
So as social norms shifted,
Okay.
people began to realize that cooperation and peaceful coexistence actually led to greater stability and prosperity for everybody.
So it's like a feedback loop. The more people behave peacefully, the more those behaviors are rewarded and reinforced, which then creates a more peaceful society overall.
Exactly. It's a virtuous cycle.
Got it.
But here's where things get a little unnerving.
Okay.
LaFrance outlines a number of factors that can make a society more susceptible to backsliding into violence.
Okay.
And you might be surprised to learn how many of these factors are actually present in America today.
Okay, so let's talk about these warning signs.
Rough.
What are we looking at?
One of the biggest red flags is wealth disparity.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, the gap between the super rich and everybody else is
Yeah.
pretty glaring right now.
Absolutely. The rising cost of living, stagnant wages, while you have these CEO salaries skyrocketing, it's pretty hard to ignore.
It is.
But how does this type of economic inequality
Yeah.
contribute to violence?
Well, think about it this way.
Okay.
When people feel like the system is rigged against them,
Uh-huh.
when they see a small elite hoarding all the wealth while they struggle to make ends meet,
Right.
it can breed resentment and distrust.
Yeah. Yeah.
It creates this us versus them mentality where people start to see those who are better off as the enemy.
Right. So it's not just about being poor.
Right.
It's about feeling like you're being left behind, like the American dream is totally out of reach. And that kind of frustration and anger, that can be a powerful motivator for violence.
You got it. And this ties into another big factor. Declining trust in institutions.
Okay.
Just look around.
Mm-hmm.
People are increasingly skeptical of the government, the media, big corporations.
It's true.
They feel like these institutions aren't working for them, that they're not being heard, that their concerns are being completely ignored.
Yeah, and you can see how that lack of trust
Right.
can lead to a sense of powerlessness, maybe even hopelessness.
Right.
And when people feel like they have no voice, no
Yeah.
agency,
Mm-hmm.
they might be more likely to lash out, to take matters into their own hands.
Exactly. And this feeling of powerlessness is often amplified by another factor LaFrance highlights,
Um,
a heightened sense of victimhood.
okay, let's dive into that a little bit.
I-
What do we mean by a heightened sense of victimhood?
It's about different groups feeling increasingly threatened and marginalized,
Okay.
whether it's based on their race, religion, political beliefs, their economic status.
Right.
They feel like they're under attack,
Yeah.
that their values and their way of life are being eroded,
Uh-huh.
and that nobody's listening to their concerns.
So it's not just about actual victimization.
Right.
It's about this perception of being victimized, this feeling of being under siege. And that can create a really dangerous us versus them dynamic.
Exactly. And this dynamic is further fueled by what LaFrance calls intense partisan estrangement.
I've definitely noticed that. It feels like political disagreements have become much more personal and just meaner in recent years.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just disagreeing on policies. It's about seeing the other side
Yeah.
as not just wrong,
Right.
but as a fundamental threat to your values, your way of life, even your very existence.
It's like we're not even speaking the same language anymore.
It is. It's like each side is living in a totally different reality.
And that lack of communication, that inability to find any common ground, it just creates a breeding ground for all this anger and resentment and ultimately violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And LaFrance points to several other factors
Okay.
that contribute to this pretty toxic mix.
Oh boy, this is getting intense.
It is.
What else should we be worried about?
Well, there's rapid demographic change,
Okay.
which can lead to anxieties about cultural shifts and a sense of displacement among certain groups.
Okay.
Then you've got the rise of conspiracy theories,
Right.
which often prey on people's fears and distrust.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget about the increasingly violent and dehumanizing rhetoric that's become so pervasive.
Especially online.
Yeah, it's like the internet has become this echo chamber for extremism.
Right. You surround yourself with people who agree with you,
Right.
reinforce those biases.
Exactly.
And it's easy to forget that there are real people with real feelings on the other side of the screen.
Absolutely. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a very sharply divided electorate. Recent elections have been incredibly close,
They have.
which underscores just how deeply polarized we are as a country.
It's like we're constantly on edge, bracing for that next political battle.
Right. And perhaps the most disturbing factor of all
Okay.
is the growing belief that violence is justified, or at least that it will go unpunished.
Wow.
LaFrance ties this back to the murder of the CEO that we talked about earlier.
Right.
The fact that some people celebrated his death is a pretty chilling example of this mindset.
It's like the idea that violence is an acceptable solution to your problems as long as it's directed at the quote-unquote right people. And that's incredibly dangerous.
It is. And we see this not just in these extreme cases
Right.
like that murder,
Yeah.
but in the way violence is often downplayed or excused in our society.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's historical injustices, police brutality, political extremism,
Yeah.
there's this tendency to minimize or rationalize violence, which creates a really dangerous slippery slope where it becomes more and more acceptable.
It's like we're seeing this perfect storm brewing
Yeah.
with all these factors feeding into each other,
Right.
creating this climate where violence is just more likely to occur. It's pretty overwhelming to think about, honestly.
I understand how you feel, but the good news is understanding these factors is the first step towards addressing them. It's not all doom and gloom.
Okay.
LaFrance does offer some hope.
Okay.
She argues that to understand where society is heading, we need to go beyond just looking at the surface
Okay.
and really examine the emotional undercurrents.
What do you mean by emotional undercurrents?
Think about the overall mood of society.
Okay.
Are people generally hopeful and optimistic,
Right.
or are they fearful, angry, resentful?
Okay.
Those negative emotions are like fuel that can easily ignite into violence.
Yeah, that makes sense. When people are constantly bombarded with these messages of fear and division and outrage, it's bound to have an impact on their emotional state. It creates a climate of anxiety and distrust that just makes it so much harder to solve problems peacefully.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual emotions. It's about the collective emotional climate of society as a whole.
Right.
When you have large groups of people who are feeling deeply alienated and resentful and unheard,
Yeah.
it creates a tinderbox
Right.
that's just waiting for a spark.
So what can we do about it? How do we shift those emotional undercurrents in a more positive direction?
Well, LaFrance doesn't offer a simple solution, but she does emphasize the importance of countering those negative emotions with positive ones.
Okay.
It's about promoting empathy and understanding and compassion even for those we might disagree with.
That sounds like a really tall order in our current climate where everything feels so polarized and everyone's at odds.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy,
Right.
but it's essential if we want to create a more peaceful and just society.
Yeah.
And it all starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own emotional contributions.
What does that look like?
Well, think about the way you interact with others,
Okay.
both online and offline.
Right.
Are you contributing to this culture of fear and division?
Okay.
Or are you promoting understanding and respect?
Mm-hmm.
Are you spreading misinformation and outrage?
Okay.
Or are you seeking out accurate information and engaging in thoughtful dialogue?
It's about being mindful of our own words and actions and realizing that even these seemingly small acts of kindness and compassion can make a difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's about actively choosing to engage in respectful dialogue, even when it's challenging.
Right.
It's about listening to understand,
Yeah.
not just to respond,
Mm-hmm.
seeking common ground,
Right.
even when we disagree.
That sounds a lot more constructive than this us versus them mentality that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And it's not about ignoring our differences
Right.
or pretending that everything's fine.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we can disagree without demonizing each other,
Okay.
that we can have different opinions without seeing each other as enemies.
It's about remembering that we're all human beings sharing this planet together.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point that LaFrance makes. We need to reject those who endorse or justify violence, no matter what their political affiliation might be.
Okay.
It's about drawing a line in the sand and saying, this far and no further.
Right.
Violence is never the answer.
Right.
It's never an acceptable solution.
But what about in situations where violence is used in self-defense or to protect others from harm? I mean, those are tricky.
But those are really complex ethical questions
Yeah.
that deserve a lot of careful consideration. But LaFrance's point is that we need to be extremely cautious about condoning or glorifying violence, even in those types of situations.
Okay.
We need to be promoting a culture of peace,
Right.
where violence is always a last resort, never a first impulse.
Right. So shifting our mindset away from violence as the solution towards more peaceful and constructive ways of resolving those conflicts.
You got it. And that requires us to develop our critical thinking skills,
Okay.
to be more discerning about the information we consume,
Yeah.
and to be able to identify and reject misinformation and propaganda, which often fuel those negative emotions that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's so important, especially today where we're constantly just bombarded with information from all sides.
It is.
It's easy to get caught up in that outrage cycle and lose sight of what's really true and what's just designed to manipulate our emotions.
Absolutely. And it's not just about being able to spot fake news or propaganda.
Right.
It's about being able to critically evaluate all information.
Okay.
Ask questions, to consider different perspectives,
Right.
and form your own informed opinions.
So being an active participant in the information landscape, not just a passive consumer.
Exactly. It's about being a critical thinker,
Yeah.
not just a blind follower.
Got it.
And that brings us to another crucial piece of countering decivilization, building bridges across these divides.
Yeah.
So this means engaging in respectful dialogue
Okay.
with people who hold different views, even if it's uncomfortable.
Right.
We need to find that common ground.
Yeah.
And remember that we're all in this together.
That sounds challenging,
It is.
but also potentially really rewarding.
It is.
I can imagine how those kinds of conversations, even if they're difficult, could help to break down stereotypes and build empathy and lead to solutions that work for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing our shared humanity, even when we disagree.
Right.
It's about understanding that we all want the same basic things.
Right.
Safety, security, opportunity, and a sense of belonging.
And those are things that we can only achieve by working together, not by fighting each other.
Exactly. And, it's not just about having these conversations in our own personal lives.
Right.
It's also about supporting institutions and initiatives
Yep.
that promote dialogue and understanding across divides.
Uh-huh.
It's about voting for leaders who are committed to building bridges, not walls.
Right.
It's about investing in education and programs that foster critical thinking and empathy.
So it's a multifaceted approach involving individual actions, systemic changes, cultural shifts.
Right.
It's about changing the way we think, the way we talk to each other, and the way we structure our society.
It's a big task,
Is.
but it's not impossible.
Right.
And, thinking about Elias's work on the civilizing process,
Okay.
it does give me hope.
Okay.
If societies can shift toward violence.
Right.
They can shift away from it.
Right.
It's not inevitable.
We're not on this runaway train headed straight for chaos.
Exactly.
We have agency. We can choose a different path.
We absolutely can. But it takes conscious effort.
Right.
We have to be aware of the forces that are at play, and we have to actively work towards creating the kind of society that we want to live in.
Okay, so we've talked about all these factors that contribute to decivilization and some ways to counter those trends. But are there any concrete things that individuals can do to make a difference? I mean, it's easy to feel so overwhelmed by the scale of these problems. What can one person really do?
That's a great question, and I think LaFrance would say that even small acts of courage and compassion can have a real ripple effect.
Okay.
It's about choosing to be kind, even when others are being cruel.
Mm-hmm.
It's about speaking up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable.
Right.
It's about being a force for good in your own community, in your own sphere of influence.
Being the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. It might sound cheesy, but it's true.
Right.
And, one of the things that really stuck with me from LaFrance's article is her emphasis on paying attention to the rhetoric that we encounter,
Yeah.
both online and offline.
Right.
Because words have power.
They do.
They can either incite violence or they can promote understanding.
Right. And I think we need to be much more mindful of the language that we use, both in our personal conversations and in the public sphere. We need to think about the impact our words might have on others
Exactly.
and be really careful not to contribute to that culture of fear and division.
You got it. We need to be critical consumers of information. We need to be asking ourselves, is this rhetoric contributing to a more peaceful society? Or is it fueling the flames of division and distrust?
So it's like a mental checklist that we should be running through whenever we encounter any kind of political or social commentary.
Yeah.
Is this constructive? Is this helpful? Is this moving us toward a better future? Or is it just adding to the noise and the anger?
That's a great way to put it. We need to be more discerning about what we consume and what we share. We have a responsibility to curate our own information diets
Right.
and to create a more positive and productive information ecosystem.
That's such a good way to put it. It's like we're all these information gardeners
yeah.
tending to the soil of our own minds,
Right.
weeding out those toxic plants,
Yes.
and cultivating the ones that will bear fruit.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And, it's not just about what we consume individually.
Right.
It's about what we collectively choose to amplify.
So not giving a platform to those who spread hate and division, not rewarding outrage and sensationalism, choosing to uplift voices that are promoting peace and understanding and constructive dialogue.
Yes, exactly. It's about using our collective voice to shape the kind of discourse that we want to see in the world.
And ultimately, that's how we create a more civilized society, right?
Yeah.
By consciously choosing to reject violence, by actively promoting peace, and by holding ourselves and each other accountable for the words we use and the actions we take.
Absolutely. It's a continuous process.
Right.
And it requires constant vigilance.
Yeah.
But it's a fight worth fighting.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great place to transition into the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, explored some really challenging concepts, and hopefully provided you with some food for thought.
Right.
When we come back, we're going to wrap up our discussion with some key takeaways and leave you with some final thoughts to ponder. So we've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff. Decivilization, violence, all these factors that make it feel like society's teetering on the edge.
Yeah.
But before we finish up, I'd really love to dig into some more concrete things we can actually do, as individuals
Okay.
to resist these trends, maybe help build a more peaceful world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that decivilization doesn't always come with like a huge crash or explosion.
Okay.
It can show up in these smaller ways too.
Oh, like what? What do you mean?
Just think about your everyday interactions, ones you have both online and offline.
Okay.
Have you noticed like an increase in rudeness or aggression, just a general lack of consideration for other people?
Yeah, I think I have. I mean, whether it's someone cutting you off in traffic or a nasty comment on social media or even just like a lack of patience and courtesy, it does feel like those small things, those little incivilities, they're becoming more and more common.
Exactly. And while those might seem minor, compared to like, say, a political assassination or a riot,
Right.
they're actually all part of the same bigger picture. It reflects a society that's becoming more fragmented, more distrustful, more tolerant of aggression in general.
So it's like a snowball effect. The more those small acts of incivility become normal,
Yeah.
the more they feed this bigger culture of disrespect.
Right.
And then that can ultimately lead to the more serious forms of violence.
Exactly. It's a slippery slope. And LaFrance says we really need to be watching for those early warning signs,
Right.
those subtle shifts in our social norms,
Hmm.
if we want to stop things from getting worse.
So it's not just about calling out violence when it happens. It's about actively choosing civility, respect in our everyday interactions,
Right.
being kind, patient, understanding, even when we're feeling stressed or annoyed.
Yeah, you're getting it.
Okay.
It's about listening to other people,
Oh.
even when we totally disagree with them,
Yeah.
treating everyone with dignity and respect,
Uh-huh.
no matter their background, their beliefs. It's about choosing to be part of the solution, not adding to the problem.
It sounds so simple,
It does.
but it's really hard to do when you're just surrounded by negativity all the time. It's easy to get sucked into that outrage and just react the same way.
It is tough, but it's so important, and it goes back to that idea of creating more positive information space.
Mm.
You know, like we need to amplify those voices that are calling for civility and empathy and understanding. We got to reward the people who are building bridges, not burning them down.
So much of this comes back to just being aware, being intentional
Yeah.
about the information we choose to consume and how we treat each other.
Right, exactly. And it's not about pretending everything's fine, like there's no conflict.
Right.
It's about choosing to engage with that conflict constructively
Right.
instead of letting it control us.
One thing that makes me feel hopeful is seeing so many people, especially younger people, who are working hard to create a more compassionate, more just world. They're not afraid to challenge the way things are, speak out against what's wrong, demand better from their leaders.
Oh, it's so true. That whole generation is growing up with such a deeper understanding of social justice and a real commitment to equality and inclusion.
Yeah.
And they're using their voices, their platforms, to actually make a difference.
It's really inspiring to see. It makes me hopeful that maybe, just maybe, we can turn things around, create a society that's more peaceful, more just, more civilized.
I hope so too.
Mm-hmm.
And I really believe we each have a role to play in that. Even small acts of kindness, of compassion, they can ripple out. So let's commit to being a force for good in the world. Yeah.
Love that. I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive on decivilization. Complex topic, heavy stuff,
Yeah,
but so important for all of us to be thinking about and talking about
it is.
if we want to build a better future for ourselves or everyone who comes after us.
Well, absolutely. It's been great exploring this with you and with everyone listening.
And to everyone out there, thank you for tuning in. Keep those brains buzzing, keep those hearts open, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.